There were so many parallels between Deepa's book and ours. Maybe it was the timing in which they were published during the so-called racial reckoning. Maybe it was because both were written from the perspective of people of color. Or maybe it was because both books shared a similar setting, corporate America.
However you look at it, both bodies of work come to similar conclusions, which is that something has to change. The institution and system as it exists today doesn't work for everyone. Work culture as it exists today is unsustainable and unhealthy. And DEI, though important and needed, isn't going to magically fix everything. So we have to find ways to continually welcome critique so we can improve outcomes for everyone. Or we can continue to believe in the fairy tale of meritocracy, which is flat out delusional.
Going back to just so many of the parallels, which is like my neck hurts from nodding my head from reading your books. I was like, gosh, yes. But in our book, we say something to the effect of the true cost of being the first is being the only. Mm-hmm. And the literal title of your book is The First, the Few, the Only. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to me a little bit about how you landed to that title and a little bit about your personal experience with being the only.
Yeah. So I landed on it because, so let me back up and explain. So here I am at this point, 16 years into my corporate career, maybe, 17 years. Again, politics and not feeling well. So I'm kind of getting pushed. I feel like in some ways, like my body is, and I believe in like the body gives you messages, and I've been ignoring it for years. And now I really have to do something. It's my entire identity, right? And I'm a partner, right? I have given up all these things. I call it almost like 10-year professorship. So I've gotten to the title and now I'm going to walk away. Like none of it made any sense externally. I'm thinking of leaving during COVID. So I left before it was called the Great Resignation, right? So just angst, and I wasn't going to anything. So in an attempt to figure out like what to do and where I wanted to go, I started gathering women of color. It started one-on-one, and I tell the story a little bit in the book, and it was just kind of over dinner, over lunch. And then Rana, my business partner, ended up doing about 10 dinners across the country. Again, I was just trying to figure out where do I want to go next and like what's a great industry or company. And instead, what we uncovered were these stories. We would get into rooms with like 20 executives. And again, we went executive just because of what I was looking for. All kinds of women of color, all industries. I thought 1 or 2 hours, 6, 7, 8 hours at 2 and 3 in the morning, we were still in the rooms finishing each other's sentences and telling stories. So from that came this idea that there's something unique about the experience about being a first, a few, or an only. How I define that is you're the first in your family, maybe to go to college or to have a professional, experience, but there's something unique, right, about the first, that experience that you have that a lot of people of color I interview, like have that sort of, like you've had to figure it out yourself. The few comes from, right, you're one of the few in your company, right? There's stories that are profound in the book about like being the only Black woman in an organization and having to represent your race, or being the only Muslim woman, right? And having to talk about your religion, right? So the sense of few. And then only, right? Like one of the only women at the C-suite. So there was something about that, right? That really felt unique to women of color. And I also think we hold up like these few examples we have of people who've made it. And I don't want to take anything away from them, right? But we hold them up, and like my tag when I sign my book is from the first, the few, the only to the many, right? Like I want to talk about how we get to the many, not just hold up the trailblazers, because there's such a shadow side, which is what you talk about, right? To trailblazing or to being an only, but we like don't give space for them to talk about it because it is hard, it is lonely, but there's no glory in talking about the negative side of it. So that's really what I wanted to give voice to, that these women are all amazing, but we're asking them not to talk about the hardship, but really just, yay, you made it, but we need to talk about how we got here and the pain if we're going to really change. Moms will say, or the women of color I interviewed would say, I want to do it differently. Like, I don't want to put that pressure on perfection, right, on my daughters. I don't want to tell them they're going to have to work 2 or 4 times as hard as their white colleagues. And yet they get to that phase and they do, because they don't know what else to tell them. Yeah. So my advice in that space is really like, remember what didn't work for you and try not to give it to the next generation. I mean, I think you have to be honest, right? Like, you walking in the world is different than me walking in the world is different than like, a white man walking down the street. And I don't want our kids to not be prepared for what they may face. At the same time, I want to do it differently. And so that's, I think, the tension in the model, right? Of like, how much do you share about to be prepared versus how much are you shaping? Like, the overwork and the perfection. So I call it performing, producing, and conforming a little bit in the book. Those behaviors, which I think are just what happens in a lot of our cultures.
That was probably one of my favorite parts of the book. You talk about, I believe there were 10 delusions that you found people had about their careers and what they might expect in the workplace. One, that word choice, I think, is so bold.
But also so perfect.
Yeah, because we talk a little bit about just the how wildly optimistic so many of us are, not just about our financial lives, but what we expect to happen in our careers. Like everyone believes that they're going to climb the ladder at some predictable rate. Everyone kind of projects this idea that they will always earn as much as they're earning now, if not more, in the foreseeable future, even though there's very little data to suggest that that's true for anyone, but particularly people of color. But I never thought about that as delusional. I never decided to use that word. And so I'm glad that you did, because it takes the pressure. Now you've given me license to use.
Yeah, no, I love that you love that word.
Yeah. I would love for you to just talk about why you chose that word and some of the most important, I guess, delusions that you think many of us are experiencing as we're thinking about our careers.
Yeah, I think this is going to be my work going forward. So I love that you love that. I would also tell you that many of the white male leaders, that's the chapter they can't get past, meaning in a positive way. Like that's the chapter they come back to. Because I think by the way, I think the delusions speak to everybody, but no one's really sat and thought about it, right? Like I think a lot of them are delusions for society, for America in particular, right, and how we work. So the delusion idea, and at one point the book was going to be called Inclusion Delusion, because it was this paradox on the more that you try to be included, or the more you rise, the sense that you're going to be, belong and included. And in fact, what I found is the more the women of color rose, the actually less they felt included, because there was more pressure to behave and perform and conform. So it comes from some of that. But I think there's a lot of the ways that we work, again, that don't work for us, that we haven't really spent time unpacking. Some of it, relates back to enslavement. Some of it relates back to this idea of the two-parent household. Like our entire work week, the way we work is based on this idea that there's two parents. One parent goes out into the workplace and that one stays home and raises the children. That model's never been updated, right? And that's what the 45-hour week is based on. So it's like these ideas of like the way we work are things that we've inherited, and they're kind of built on broken and, inappropriate or egregious or bad, right? Policies and procedures and ways of working. And so like one of the big questions I have in general is like, can you remake, or do we have to completely take down before we can, get to a place where we want to get? That's like my bigger, where I spend a lot of my time dreaming and thinking. But I think the delusions are really these things that we've been taught about how it is, that I don't believe has to be how it is. And yet most of us haven't been taught that we can question the system, we can push on the system. And I find this especially with the people of color that I work with, right? They've been taught like, asking questions, attention, pushing on the system can bring really bad results. And as a result, we kind of all, don't push back on things that don't make sense. So the 10 delusions, there probably could have been 50, but there are things from like, there's not enough qualified women of color or people of color. Well, that's a delusion, because if you had my network, you would find them. If they had your network, they would find them. It's literally, this bias that we tend to have networks that look like us. And so that's kind of an example of a delusion. Another delusion is this idea of, and I said this before, this idea that the pie is set, or the tables at the seats at the table are set. Like there's 12 seats at the table. So if I'm up for a board position or a C-level position, I'm going to take it from somebody else because it has to go to a woman of color or a woman. So that why I call it in a delusion of, I got white man, like this idea that we're taking and redistributing is another one, right? So, and then the idea that DE&I is going to fix everything, right? Like it's not, this is cultural. This is generational. This is like, so entrenched in how we think and we behave as people. And there's such shame and pain associated with it. So it's like these ideas that we haven't unpacked, but I also think there's other ones, right? About how we work, and that it has to be lonely to rise, that we can't rise with community, that this work, like, that being successful is individualistic. So this is a lot of where my work is headed. This idea, and I'm playing with this title still, but the corporate fairy tale, that this idea that you know, that story, that ending doesn't work for most of us. And so how do we want to rewrite it? What should that story look like? And I just think, I want us to question what we've been taught about work. Like
we hope you enjoyed this episode of Cashing Out the Podcast. To see more videos like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to turn on your notifications. To get your copy of Cashing Out the book, visit Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore, or download the audiobook on Audible.